Hi everyone, I'm Rincey and this is Rincey Reads. Today I'm back to do a book review and I'm going to be talking about The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. And if for some reason you're not aware, this is the prequel to the Hunger Games series. So this prequel takes place during the 10th annual Hunger Games and you are following Coriolanus Snow, whose first name in my head this entire time I thought was Cornelius, and it wasn't until this book that I realized I was wrong. But that's neither here nor there, and I'm mainly just going to refer to him as Snow because there's a very good chance that if I had to remember his first name, I will just refer to him as Cornelius. Just so we're all clear and we're all starting off from the same place. But anyways, so Snow is a student at the academy at the capital, and he and his family are basically like suffering pretty significantly after the war. His parents have both passed away, and it's just him, his cousin, and his grandmother who all just live in like their penthouse, but they don't have any money at all. He works very hard to make sure that no one realizes how poor and hard off that their family is doing. Basically, their family had a bunch of stuff invested in like District 13, and then during the war, District 13 was, completely destroyed, and so they basically ran out of any sort of funds or anything along those lines. So yeah, they are struggling a whole lot. And so this year at the Hunger Games, it's been decided that they are going to take some of the students from the academy, some of the top students, and make them mentors. And so getting like a tribute from District 1 or 2 is considered basically like the best option because they tend to do relatively the best at the Hunger Games because they have better resources and things along those lines. But Snow ends up getting this girl from District 12 whose name is Lucy Snow. He already feels like he's behind because again he has this girl from District 12, but he's like determined to win because this will potentially lead to like prizes and things like that he could use because again his family has no money. But also he starts to like actually see that there's potential in this girl and things along those lines. And the story basically like follows a year of the Hunger Games plus some, and you get to see like how Snow ends up becoming the President Snow that we know in the regular Hunger Games trilogy. So obviously these books are very popular, and there was a lot of sort of hand-wringing, I suppose, or maybe not hand-wringing, but maybe like questioning when it came to the details about this book. I think a lot of people, including myself, were very excited when they saw that there was going to be a Hunger Games prequel because with the Hunger Games, there's so much that's presented to you, and kind of being able to see how some of that stuff comes into play or how some of that stuff is developed or anything along those lines could potentially be really interesting. There's also like a lot of people that we know about from the Hunger Games books who are like older than Katniss and things like that who have competed at other Hunger Games. So people were wondering if it was going to be about them. In the end, it was announced that the book was going to be about Snow, and everyone was just like... which I think is a very understandable response to that sort of announcement, because finding out that the villain is going to get this sort of sympathetic backstory is a little bit disconcerting, and like, is that really as interesting? But I think that this book overall was kind of worth it. Like, I won't say that this book needed to exist, and I won't say that this book made my experience with the Hunger Games trilogy like significantly better, but I do think that this added some interesting history and layers to the original trilogy that just kind of like gives them a little extra pop. I feel like most everyone is going to be like wondering like whether or not this is worth picking up, and I think that it is. Like, I enjoyed reading this book, and I do think that there's some like interesting things that Suzanne Collins develops in here. She's still like a really great writer. She still loves that 3-act structure. There's 3 parts of this book, so it's very clearly defined in here. She still does those like cliffhanger chapter endings and creates like interesting and sympathetic characters, although I don't think that this is necessarily like the best Hunger Games book by any means, but I do think that it was like an enjoyable reading experience. I read this book pretty quickly. I read almost the entire thing in a day because I just found it to be really encapsulating. Like, Suzanne Collins is really great at creating these worlds that like suck you in and these storylines that suck you in and like keeping you attached to the story, but it's not quite as like captivating as some of the other Hunger Games books in my opinion. I do think that this book is too long. It's over 500 pages. And like to its credit, it does have like the larger print that the Hunger Games books all have because it's in that sort of like young adult font size, I suppose. But I do think that this book is too long for what it is. And that's definitely like one of the downsides to this book. And there's definitely some like ebbs and flows in terms of like my own interest in what was happening in the story, but when it captivated me, it really captivated me. I feel like I have to say, like, I'm not like a Hunger Games super fan, so I like have read the trilogy, really enjoyed them, have watched the movie, really enjoyed those two for the most part, but that's like the extent of my like interest in the Hunger Games. Like, I never got super into the fandom. I don't know all of the characters by heart, all of that stuff. I don't know the history, things like that. So, you know, take what I say with a grain of salt or whatever. But there are a couple of things about this book that I found like really interesting. And I think one of them is the fact that this book, because it's set before the Hunger Games, it's much closer to what our current world is, which is both interesting and disturbing, but also you can kind of see what the evolution of the Hunger Games would look like, and it feels very realistic in my opinion. So like I said, this is taking place during the 10th annual Hunger Games, and there's a lot of things that don't exist yet in the Hunger Games in this book, which I found to be really interesting. And for me, it was like kind of funny because I was reading things in the book and I'm just like, that feels different. And then I realized like, oh, this is taking place like years before the Hunger Games that we read about. And so it makes sense that there would be like a more toned down version of the Hunger Games, as toned down as, you know, putting a bunch of kids in an arena to kill each other can be. But it definitely is like more toned down. And I thought that that was such a like smart choice by Suzanne Collins, and it's probably something she realized as well, because it made me think about like the way our current reality television world works. And if you think about like the original reality TV shows, if you think of things like the original seasons of The Real World or anything along those lines, like those are super tame compared to what currently airs on TV, or even if you think about like the original seasons of Survivor or their Amazing Race and things like that, they are significantly more tame than they are now, where they add in all of these twists and there's extra strings being put into place that the producers and the people behind the scenes can pull and all of that stuff. And the same thing is true in the Hunger Games. Like, there are still strings obviously that are being pulled and manipulated, but you can see them realizing that there's a lack of interest in the Hunger Games, and you can see sort of how they change things in order to compensate for that. I really enjoyed sort of seeing that and thinking about sort of the evolution of the Hunger Games. And a lot of that is like discussed explicitly in this book. Some of the things that Snow and his classmates have to do is like think about like what they could do to make it more interesting. And so like one of them is the fact that there's no like gifting system in the Hunger Games yet. And so it's Snow and his classmates who come up with things like betting on the tributes and the audience providing gifts for tributes and things like that. You can see sort of the early ruminations of like what will be in the future. And so there are like fun little Easter eggs like that woven throughout the story. But I do feel like at the same time, some of the references and callbacks were a little bit like cheesy. I don't want to say heavy-handed, but like kind of cheesy. There's like a line that Lucy Gray says in here where she was like, I didn't think the odds were in my favor. And I was like, all right, Suzanne Collins. And there's like a whole thing about mockingjays in this book that I guess like explains President Snow's sort of feelings towards mockingjays, but at the same time, I found it to be a little bit heavy-handed. I will say like one thing about this story is that like nothing really feels surprising in any way. Like I feel like in the other books, one, you get really attached to the tributes. So when the tributes are dying in the Hunger Games, you feel emotions. And in this book, that doesn't really happen. And two, because it's like the start of the rebellion and stuff like that, there's other people who you get attached to and then they like die or something happens to them. And I didn't really feel that connection to any of the characters in here. It might possibly be because this is all told from Snow's perspective, and Snow is this character who, while you're seeing this more like innocent and like sympathetic side to him, he's still pretty like manipulative and selfish and like thinks about people in terms of like the benefit that they provide to him. So this isn't like a completely like he was such an innocent boy and then all of these terrible things happened to him type of person. He has had terrible things happen to him, but he also does make a lot of like selfish decisions that very much inform sort of what happens to him later on. And so I feel like that also kind of feeds into the experience that you have as a reader, because you don't have someone like Katniss who's extremely sympathetic, who cares a lot about the people around her, and therefore you end up caring a lot about the people around her. Like in this sense, like Snow doesn't really understand the people around him very much, or views them all in light of like what they provide to him, or views them all pretty suspiciously, and therefore like you as a reader are kept at a distance from everyone as well. So yeah, like every time there was a character death of any kind, I was just like, okay, and then like basically kept moving. There are like one or two surprises in here, but even those didn't really affect me emotionally the way that the original trilogy did. This is a book that's like really hard to rate. If I'm gonna give it a Goodreads reading, I would say it's like a 3.5 star book. Like it's not my favorite, like I said, but I'm not like upset at all by the existence of this book, if that makes sense. And I do think that like if you're a fan of the Hunger Games and you're like intrigued by stuff like this, like I don't think there's any real harm in reading this book, but it didn't really blow me away. And so yeah, like I said at the beginning, like does this book need to exist? Probably not. But am I mad that it exists? Not at all. I just wish that, you know, it was like a little bit smaller in size. But if Suzanne Collins wants to do a thing where she like revisits old Hunger Games and like talks about them and, you know, possibly gives us some backstory on other characters that exist in this universe, I would 100% be there for it. So those are my quick thoughts on the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Please let me know down below if you read this book what your thoughts were on it, because I know a lot of people have been reading it. I've been working really hard to like avoid Goodreads for the past couple of days because I really didn't want other people's opinions of this book to color my own opinion before I had a chance to read it and talk about it and process it myself. But now that I have, I'm going to definitely check out to see what other people are saying, but feel free to leave a comment down below letting me know your thoughts on it if you've picked it up already, or if you have any like other questions or comments about the book in general. Feel free to leave that down in the comment section below. Or if you don't plan on picking up the book and just were interested to see my thoughts on it, I'd love to know why you maybe are not picking up the book, because I also think that's an interesting conversation. So yeah, that's all I have for now, and thanks for watching.